Hello, I'm Naomi Pace, and I'm with the New Israel Fund. Today we're going to be speaking with Hagai Elad, who is the Executive Director of the Association for Civil Rights in Israel, which is the flagship grantee of the New Israel Fund. There are a lot of serious issues going on in Israel right now, particularly having to do with human rights, civil rights, and defending democracy. And hopefully, Hagai and I will be able to tell you a little bit about each of them. Welcome, Hagai, to the United States. It's nice to see you here.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have certainly picked an interesting time to come visit us. Just yesterday, the newspaper Haaretz reported the results of a new poll. And apparently, more than half of the Jewish Israelis in this poll think there's too much freedom of expression in Israel. And they think that human rights groups should be gagged, essentially, if they are too critical of the Israeli government or speak about the immoral conduct of the Israeli army. What is your feeling about that?
Yeah, it's especially disheartening, the results of that poll, but certainly not surprising given the general atmosphere that we are facing in Israel in the broadest of context with regard to the ability of the human rights community to continue doing its work and the very legitimacy of our existence, our functioning. And I think that perhaps the most troubling aspect is that things that we have taken for granted for many years, I think indeed decades, that freedom of speech is safeguarded, that the ability of organizations such as ACRI and many other NAF grantees to continue doing their job is obvious. That is not something that we need to invest any resources in. That is no longer the case, and that is deeply troubling. And when I think of the results of the poll, then I think of two things. I think of fundamental misunderstanding, and I think of fear. So with regard to fundamental misunderstanding, the fact that, for instance, 98%, I think, of those questioned are saying we are for freedom of speech, but 50% or a bit more than that say there's too much freedom of speech, that's a fundamental misunderstanding. And the reason groups such as ours exist is exactly so that we and everyone else will be able to say almost everything that they want to say, including the stuff that is controversial, including the stuff that is not popular, including the positions that are critical of government policies, of IDF actions, and everything else. These are essential ingredients of a functioning democracy.
What you're saying is that Israelis favor freedom of speech in the abstract as long as it's freedom of speech that doesn't upset anyone or doesn't criticize the government, and at the point it represents an unpopular point of view, that's where the problem is?
Yeah, I think it goes back to a grasp of the concept of democracy as if that's just about the rule of the majority, and foregoing almost completely that formal democracy is, well, the majority rules. That's nice, that's far from sufficient. A material and essential democracy is one where the rights of minorities are preserved, where there are constitutional rights, and part of that obviously is freedom of speech.
Well, the debate's been defined by some on the right as Zionism versus disloyalty to the state. There is a member of the Knesset from the Kadima party who said, we should revoke the legitimacy of the groups and foundations that directly or indirectly fund activities against the interests of the State of Israel as a Jewish, Zionist, democratic state. How do you see this divide, and how would you respond to that member of Knesset?
Yeah, I think that maybe for American viewers, just listening to the question maybe evokes memories from the McCarthy era in the 1950s in this country. What we need in Israel is a space a broad space, where people are able to hash out their differences on a broad variety of issues without being labeled as enemies of the state. And that is the dangerous process that is happening. And I think that, framing the question, whether it's about national security or about democratic values, that's the wrong question. I think that a future of the State of Israel, and indeed of any democracy, that is not founded in democratic values, that's a very unsafe future. Part of building a safer future is also building a more just future. And that is what we learned from history. That is what we've learned in this country and in many other countries.
as long as we are talking about some unpopular and controversial issues, just recently there was an attack on the New Israel Fund. Actually, there have been a series of attacks on the New Israel Fund by a right-wing group by the name of Im Tirtzu. We're not going to go into the allegations. They've been debunked. They've been forgotten about. But Im Tirtzu had two guys hanging posters in Jerusalem criticizing the New Israel Fund. Criticizing is probably an understatement. And when they were arrested by the police, ACRI went to their defense.
I want to live in a society where it is obvious for everyone, including the police, that putting up such posters, even if it's in bad taste, even if it's very offensive, not even, especially when it's very offensive and controversial, is absolutely okay. And no one should be concerned that if they do that, they may be arrested. Freedom of speech is not a matter of left or right. It's essential that it's protected for everyone. And indeed, the very cases where we need to intervene is not when people are saying stuff that is popular and embraced by everyone, because in that case, there will never be any issue. It's exactly the cases where it is unpopular and sometimes offensive and sometimes crude that you need to intervene and say, yeah, that is essential for us. It is in my interest that the people from Im Tirtzu, for instance, will be able to continue attacking NIF, ACRI, and have their freedom of speech. We do not wish to silence them. We want to argue with them.
Let me take a step back. The settler organizations are very powerful. They appear to be very well funded. Right now, there is a bill pending in the Knesset that addresses the funding for ACRI and other groups on the progressive side of the ledger. And the bill would essentially penalize your organization and many other organizations for accepting any kind of funding from foreign governments, whether it's the United States or the EU or Western European government. Well, it seems, at least superficially, that there is some argument for this bill. Why does the Danish government or the Norwegian government get to pay an Israeli human rights group to do whatever it does? Isn't that interference in Israeli internal affairs? I know that the foreign funding bill would be very onerous for ACRI. You wouldn't be able to open your mouth in an interview like this without first saying, oh, by the way, I accept money from a foreign government. But it also seems that this legislation does not address the much more opaque funding for the settler groups and the groups on the right. They may not be taking money from foreign governments, but they are taking money from somewhere. We're not quite sure where.
Yeah. It's been very carefully crafted so that it only targets the groups that they really want to shut down or at least weaken. It presents itself as if it's about transparency, but the real agenda is very easily exposed. And as you said very rightfully, I have already, if this law was already in place, have acted a criminal offense because I haven't prefixed the entire thing by presenting myself as some sort of foreign agent. Me and many of my colleagues in Israel. We are for transparency. Our funding is transparent, always has been, always will be. We already report that in duplicate, and if there is a desire for more bureaucracy, we'll be doing it very carefully, as we've always done. And all our funding is reported on the annual basis to the Register of Nonprofit and is publicly available information. It's a non-issue. Adding another layer of transparency, but only with regard to funding from foreign state entities, as exactly as you asked, is it less interesting or relevant for Israeli citizens to know other sources of foreign funding, private sources of foreign funding for other NGOs in Israel? I think it's as equally interesting. And our response was, you want more transparency? That's fine, as long as it's applied in an equal way with regard to everyone.
Hagai, thank you so much for spending this time with us. If you would like to find out more about the New Israel Fund and the issues we work on in Israel, please visit our website at www.nif.org. If you would like to find out more about ACRI and the very important work that they are doing in Israel, please visit that website at www.acri.org.il. And thank you so much for spending this time with us today.